Drug use during World War II is something that's always been mentioned, but it might not be at the forefront of our minds when we think about the war. They certainly left this topic out at school, and we don't really see it in popular war movies. Were the Germans really on meth? What on earth were Japanese kamikaze pilots on? And what did the Allies take that we never hear about? Stay tuned as I explore the stimulants and drug use of World War II. Our story starts at the Olympic Games in Berlin, 1936. For obvious reasons, it was a very controversial games, and Germany as hosts would sweep up and top the medal table. However, many Americans outperformed and beat Germans in events they weren't quite expected to. America's pharmaceutical companies were at work as they developed a new amphetamine which could increase the endurance of some of its athletes, and this is exactly the drug that they gave certain athletes at the games. This would inspire German chemist Fritz Hauschild, the head chemist at pharmaceutical company Temmler in Berlin. He developed the first German methamphetamine in the late 30s and patented it under the name Pervitin. After it was branded as Pervitin, it was sold all over the country to businessmen and students and other working professionals. You could compare it to the mass consumption of Adderall in the US today. German army physiologist Otto Ranke recognized the military value of methamphetamines in the late 30s. He found the drug could keep soldiers awake, particularly pilots, alerted on limited sleep, and increase a sense of euphoria. Ranke himself took 2 Pervitin a day as he studied it. I can only assume this was through personal use, but he later discovered that the drug was extremely addictive and should be used with caution. It was Otto Ranken's research that led to the drug being used by Nazi soldiers. The secret to Germany's fast advancement through Europe was their infamous panzer divisions, which maintained rapid advancing speed day and night, and of course, they were powered by Pervitin. Germany began its advances through Poland in 1939, medical offers in the field reporting mass euphoria among soldiers who displayed ferocious fighting skills and little to no fatigue. In just 2 weeks, they would overrun the whole of Poland, with, don't get me wrong here, precise battle tactics, but ultimately powered by copious amounts of Pervitin. The success in Poland ensured Pervitin was here to stay for the German army. Even Hitler himself would be on it. I mean, of course. The Battle of France in 1940. The invasion of France was hugely ambitious by Hitler as the French and British forces hugely outnumbered the Germans. This meant the Germans had to move fast through day and night. And how would they achieve that, I wonder? 35 million Pervitin pills for the campaign, of course. Soldiers would be given 1 a day and 1 at night, and if necessary they could take another one after 2 hours of their first dose. This would allow for 24-hour alertness and absolutely zero fear while fighting the enemy. Otto Ranke also provided an instruction pamphlet for the medical officers who were handing out Pervitin like it was a penny sweet. The pamphlet warned of negative side effects, depressive moods while on the drug, and of course high blood pressure. Obviously, these warnings were mainly ignored, and Germany saw many reports of heart failure on the battlefield and suicide due to the heightened anxiety caused by extreme methamphetamine use. Germany would continue to surprise the Allies with unpredictable and speedy advances. Of course, the unpredictable behaviour also being a feature of meth users. And I think that's important to remember. Meth, these guys are literally on meth. They have guns, they have tanks, they have artillery, and they're also on meth. This must have been absolutely terrifying. The Nazis burst through the Allies' defences in approximately just 6 weeks. Germany would conquer a significant portion of Western Europe, including Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and most of France, including Paris, in just 6 weeks. By the end of the campaign, the German army scaled back the use of the drug because of lots of delirium, heart failure, and suicides it noticed in its troops. It was also being used less by the public as the manufacturers admitted to the drug's addictiveness. However, the drug did have a resurgence on the Eastern Front towards the end of the war to keep dejected soldiers enthusiastic about horrific conditions. By 1944, the Germans were taking increasing losses as they were experimenting with a Hail Mary attempt to turn any last remaining soldier into a fighting machine. As if meth by itself wasn't enough, they were developing a new drug called DIX. The ingredients consisted of methamphetamine, cocaine, and oxycodone. They tested the drug on prisoners in concentration camps, with the idea that as well as being able to fight harder for longer without rest, they also wouldn't experience any pain. The test showed an incredible ability to march insane distances, however the drug's side effects were extreme, and while the German military were interested in its potential, it never reached mass distribution due to the collapsing German infrastructure and the Allies advancing in the final stages of the war. Cocaine was also sometimes used by German pilots and tank crews in combination with Pervitin to stay alert during long combat missions.
Conquer the world and eviscerate your enemies.
Cocaine's stimulating effects help soldiers maintain focus during high-stress situations. But like methamphetamine, it had significant addictive qualities and harmful side effects. The Luftwaffe pilots in particular were known to mix cocaine and Pervitin to endure long bombing runs and aerial dogfights. Sustaining quick reflexes in these situations were crucial, and the cocaine and Pervitin helped a treat, I'm sure. But what about these poor bastards fighting against these methed up Germans? Well, this might sound like I'm making it up, based on a French stereotype, but in France, every soldier would have a box of Bordeaux's finest rouge in its rations. Yes, red wine in the trenches with the boys. What could be better? This practice dated back to the First World War, with the idea that it would help soldiers deal with the stress of combat and the monotony of military life. The French military also encouraged tobacco use, as cigarettes were often included in soldiers' rations. French soldiers, like their Allied counterparts, smoked extensively in the trenches or on the front lines, and smoking was a way to cope with stress, pass the time and maintain alertness. Unlike most other armies during the war, France did not adopt the use of any amphetamines. It wasn't until the end of the war, in 1943, the Free French forces, particularly those fighting under Allied command, had access to amphetamine-based stimulants from the British and Americans. Like it was in every army during this time, morphine was used as the #1 military medicine to treat pain and injuries. The French medics, like those in other armies, carried morphine syrettes to administer to wounded soldiers. The use of morphine helped soldiers endure the pain and severe injuries, but led to many cases of dependency. Other painkillers such as aspirin or opium-based medications were also administered for pain relief, but were used sensibly and carefully controlled, unlike the German drug use. As mentioned earlier, fighting alongside the French were my people, the British. Unlike the French, the Brits did administer drugs to fight against these methed out Germans. I mean, if you can't beat them, join them, am I right? Obviously, the Allies didn't have access to the German Pervitin, but instead they used an American-developed amphetamine, Benzedrine. First produced in the States in the 1930s to cure depression, but the drug's effects weren't well understood at the time. By 1937, the pill form of the drug came out, and there was an understanding that the drug could be used to keep soldiers awake during extended periods. Pervitin, being a methamphetamine, was much more potent than Benzedrine, which was an amphetamine. More on the differences later, but essentially Pervitin was stronger, but also has much worse side effects. The British didn't use drugs to the extent of the Germans. It was used a little more sparingly. The use of amphetamines grew significantly after the Battle of Britain in 1940, where fighter pilot crews needed to stay alert during long air missions. The stimulant was also given to bombing crews, tank crews, and some ground soldiers to endure long patrols or combat. Despite its effectiveness, we know amphetamines' use came with side effects such as jitteriness, aggression, mood swings, and soldiers were not always informed about the potential risks of dependency. The British government were careful about how drug use was discussed publicly. There was little public disclosure about the widespread use of stimulants, as military leaders wanted to avoid the perception that soldiers were being drugged into fighting. Also, it wasn't just the French who would ration out alcoholic beverages. For the British, however, it wasn't the army, it was the navy. The Royal Navy maintained the tradition of giving sailors a daily rum ration, a long-standing practice known as the tote of rum. It was meant to boost morale and keep soldiers warm and resilient during long shifts at sea. The rum ration retained a staple of the British Navy until the 1970s. Over here on the British Isles, we love smoking fags. A very different meaning if you're an American, but just trust me, I'm telling you that it means smoking a cigarette. The British government, like other allied nations, distributed cigarettes as part of its standard ration. Tobacco consumption reached high levels among British soldiers, and the habit was reinforced by popular advertising campaigns that depicted smoking as a mainly patriotic activity. Another staple of British soldiers' rations was, of course, caffeine in the form of tea.
Lovely. It's not everyone who can make a good cup of tea.
Tea was seen as a morale booster and a way to keep troops energized during breaks or long periods of activity. However, I doubt it had anything on the Germans' use of the meth. Fighting alongside the Germans, we had the Italians. The fascist regime under Mussolini promoted the idea of a tough, self-resilient Italian soldier. The use of drugs and stimulants outside of the cultural norms, such as wine, were not encouraged or promoted in official propaganda. But inside that cultural norm, we of course once again had vino. Wine was often provided as part of regular rations, especially in the early stage of the war when Italy still had access to its domestic supplies. Wine and many other forms of alcohol were ingrained into Italian culture, so it played an important role in social bonding amongst troops, as well as all the other benefits we've already mentioned. Smoking was deeply embedded into the culture also, as soldiers would also get cigars in their rations as well as cigarettes. To keep furthering these stereotypes, caffeine through coffee was also a key stimulant used by the Italian troops, particularly in the colder mountainous regions like the Alps, or during prolonged combat situations. It was a culturally important stimulant and morale booster, much like tea was for the British. As the war trudged on, Italy faced severe supply shortages, particularly after 1943, when the country was divided between Allied-occupied South and the German-occupied North. Access to the cultural luxuries became very limited. Over on the Eastern Front, those Germans started to once again increase poverty in an attempt to invigorate troops during the harsh winters and the grueling fighting. Their formidable enemy, who in my mind actually were one of the main reasons the Nazi Empire came to crumble, were the Russians. But what was fueling these stoic Russians during some of the worst battles seen during the war? Unlike most other nations we've already spoken about, the Soviet Union did not include amphetamines or other stimulants like the Germans, British or Americans. The Soviets were generally quite skeptical of the use of performance-enhancing drugs, in part because it had concerns over addiction and discipline. Well, that later changed, of course, but that's a whole other topic. While other armies would use stimulants to keep their soldiers awake during long operations, the Soviets relied more on traditional forms of endurance, like strict discipline and harsh training. Very Russian. The only real stimulant used by Soviet forces would have been tea, which probably went down quite a treat in minus 30 degrees Stalingrad trenches. But of course tea wasn't the only cope used by Soviets. Of course, the beverage of choice was vodka. I'm sure we've all seen many videos online of Russian men doing the most outlandish activities in the name of entertainment. We can only assume fueled by the Russian potato water. After the German invasion in 1941, the Soviets began supplying 3.5 ounces of vodka per day per troop in an attempt to boost morale, help soldiers cope with fear, and fortify them against the harsh conditions of combat. Vodka was particularly common among frontline troops, especially during significant battles such as the Battle of Stalingrad or the Siege of Leningrad, but it was seen as a way to reduce stress and boost courage before combat. The practice of distributing vodka was sometimes controversial, as it would lead to drunkenness and often affect the soldiers' discipline. However, it was viewed as an important part of sustaining morale and was deeply embedded in military culture during the war. Soviet soldiers, like their counterparts in other militaries, smoked heavily during the war. Cigarettes were often traded amongst troops to improve camaraderie, because how on earth could you be from Eastern Europe and not love a ciggy? The Soviet Union faced enormous logistical challenges throughout the war, particularly in terms of supplying its troops with all the basic necessities. As a result, access to alcohol and cigarettes and other medical supplies became increasingly hard. Despite these challenges, the Soviets made extreme efforts to make sure that every soldier received their vodka rations. After the war, many Soviet veterans struggled with alcohol dependency, as the wartime practice of distributing vodka had ingrained heavily drinking habits among many soldiers. Alcoholism became a significant issue in Soviet society after the war, with many veterans continuing to rely on alcohol as a way to cope with the trauma that they had experienced, which in turn perhaps leaves a lasting effect even today. Over the course of the war, Finland flip-flopped between allying with Germany as they fought off a Soviet invasion to eventually joining the Allies and fighting against the Germans. But Finn soldier Amino Koivunen had a personal experience that might be one of the most chaotic of any soldiers in the whole war. Imagine peacefully skiing through Lapland when suddenly you're ambushed by Russians, terrifying even today without the context of war. Koivunen was a Finnish soldier assigned to a ski patrol on the 15th of March in 1944, along with several other Finnish soldiers 3 days into their mission, they were surrounded by Soviet forces. The Finnish troops managed to escape, with Koven leading the group. For a burst of energy, he pulled out the Pervitin tablets he had in his pocket, but because of the snow, they were all frozen and stuck together. So he just shoved them in and off he went. It wasn't long before he found himself isolated, and he had left his whole patrol behind. It turned out he didn't just take 1 or 2 Pervitin tablets that may have been stuck together. He ended up taking the squad's whole supply of Pervitin. In a state of delirium, Koivunen skied on, and he would continue to ski over 250 miles. He was later found and admitted to a nearby hospital after being injured by a landmine. His heart rate was racing at nearly 200 beats per minute, and he only weighed 43 kilograms. That's 95 pounds. He lived to the ripe old age of 71 and didn't die until 1989. Later in the war, once the Americans pulled their finger out, they decided to join the fight and send troops to help with the D-Day invasion, a reaction against the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. US soldiers used Benzedrine, the drug they were already selling to the British, which we've previously spoken about. The tablets were in every man's kit, and it's not something we often see in World War II films, but it was absolutely vital for the American soldier. This is why Benzedrine became so popular with the Beat generation. In the late 40s and 50s, as lots of soldiers became addicted to it, and there became a huge black market for it back home. By the end of the war, 15 million tablets of amphetamine were produced a month in the United States. This was enough amphetamine for 500,000 people to take Benzedrine each day. This widespread use helped fuel its misuse, and the risk of dependency wasn't quite understood yet. The use of Benzedrine was most common in soldiers engaged in demanding tasks like paratroopers or night patrols. As I mentioned earlier, Benzedrine being an amphetamine rather than a methamphetamine offered slightly different effects to what the cracked out Germans were experiencing. Amphetamines work by increasing the levels of dopamine in your brain. This leads to an increased alertness, focusedness and energy levels, and a slight feeling of euphoria. When used in prescribed doses, amphetamine has therapeutic effects without producing significant highs. Whereas methamphetamine also increases dopamine, but its effects are much more intense and much longer lasting. It releases a massive amount of dopamine, leading to an intense euphoric high.
This kicks like a mule with his balls wrapped in duct tape!
As you might have guessed, meth is much more addictive because of the stronger amounts of dopamine being released, making users chase the crash after the euphoric feeling. Today, amphetamine is primarily used in a medical setting to treat ADHD and narcolepsy. You might have heard of the popular amphetamine used by over 50 million Americans today, Adderall. Methamphetamine is much more potent, has a higher potential for abuse, and is much more harmful, both physically and mentally. Methamphetamine is primarily known as a street drug, infamous for its addictive nature and devastating effects on its users. Of course, cigarettes were also a major part of American military life during World War II. The US government worked closely with major American tobacco companies to ensure that soldiers were supplied with cigarettes. Brands like Lucky Strike, Camel, and Chesterfield were heavily advertised and shipped to soldiers in their rations. The war helped solidify tobacco as a widely accepted and normalised habit for American men, and cigarette consumption skyrocketed during and after the conflict, leading to widespread smoking habits among many veterans. Another American staple, of course, was coffee, which was also included in rations. Soldiers were supplied with instant coffee in their field rations, providing a quick source of caffeine to keep them alert. Americans were also given chocolate rations, which included caffeine and sugar to provide energy. Hershey's actually designed a chocolate bar called the Hershey's Tropical Bar, designed to withstand heat and rough handling in tropical climates, making it a common part of rations for soldiers in the Pacific Theatre. The US military had a vast supply chain during World War II, which allowed for the widespread distribution of all these substances. The industrial capacity of the US meant that cigarettes, coffee, alcohol, and even drugs like amphetamines and morphine were readily available for troops stationed all around the world. The war also led to an increased cooperation between the military and industries like tobacco and pharmaceutical companies, ensuring a steady flow of these products to the front lines. Also, again, maybe a stereotype here, but the Americans did receive Coca-Cola during World War II. For Americans, it became a symbol of home and the American culture available overseas. The US military worked with Coca-Cola to ensure that the soldiers can enjoy the beverage wherever they were stationed. In 1941, Coke's president Robert Woodruff famously declared that every American should be able to get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever they were, no matter what it cost the company. This became known as the Coca-Cola Plan. The company set up bottling plants all over the world. And with help from the military, these plants were set up in areas where large numbers of US troops were stationed, including Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. The drink was actually so closely associated with American soldiers during the war that many locals from countries like France, Belgium, and Italy referred to US troops as the Coca-Cola Army. The distribution of Coca-Cola all over the world during World War II is partially why the brand is probably so globally recognised today. Last but not least, of course, we have the Japanese. Ah yes, those crazy Japanese pilots who were doing mini 911s before 9/11 was even a thing. They had to be on drugs, right? Well, yes, you'd be correct for thinking so. Philipon was the brand of methamphetamine that the Japanese used. It was introduced to Japan in the 1930s and was used to enhance worker productivity in many different industries. As the war intensified, the Japanese military began to distribute Philipon among soldiers, especially in demanding situations where fatigue and prolonged combat situations were common. These grueling campaigns in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, some of the main theatres of combat, Philipon was most used. Of course, the Japanese kamikaze pilots were given Philipon before their missions to suppress fear and boost focus, ensuring that they could complete their suicide missions with determination. Methamphetamines made them feel invincible and detached from the emotional and physical consequences of their actions. The Japanese military culture placed a heavy emphasis on discipline, duty, and sacrifice, which shaped attitudes towards substance use. Unlike the Soviets, who distributed vodka to keep soldiers warm and boost morale, the Japanese military used alcohol and drugs like methamphetamines in a more strategic and ritualistic approach. Japanese soldiers would sometimes have access to sake for ritualistic purposes. For example, before kamikaze pilots would go on their missions, they would often drink sake as part of their farewell rituals. Bushido, the samurai code of conduct, was central to the military ethos. Soldiers were expected to endure suffering and hardship without complaint, and drug use was sometimes seen as a way to suppress weakness and perform at higher levels. The more culturally common stimulants used by Japanese were green tea and rice balls. They were used by soldiers as a quick energy source. However, as the war went on and Japan faced increasing shortages of food and resources, these luxuries became rare, and soldiers often had to survive on minimal rations. Across the whole of Asia's history, you see many struggles of opium, with the Opium Wars of the 19th century, and during World War II it was no different. In Japan, they had opium dens operating to fund the war efforts. Japanese pharmaceutical firm Hung Chi Sang Tang sold significant amounts of opium, with sales reaching nearly 300 million yuan in 1941. Before the war, Japan's empire started to increase its anti-opium policies as the country saw huge black market use. The government viewed opium as being uncivilized and a lazy practice, and the punishment was strict. However, all in the name to fund their war efforts, the opium trade was back. After the war, of course, much of Japan seeing huge devastation, they experienced significant problems with methamphetamine and opium addiction. The widespread use of Philipon during the war led to a post-war epidemic of methamphetamine abuse, as a surplus of stockpiles of the war flooded onto the civilian black market. Soldiers who had become dependent on methamphetamines during the war continued to use them after returning home, contributing to a growing public health crisis. It's really interesting to me that each nation was largely fueled by a crazy concoction of drugs that we don't often hear about in the mainstream. As well as these drugs, the cultural importance of other stimulants for each nation really speaks to the need of home comforts while in the far from home reality of war.